This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about you.
Hello and welcome into episode 119, TBNs and TANs Revisited. Back on episode 99, I had a very special guest, fellow senior analyst Suzi, sit down with me and talk about a newsletter she worked on, focusing on TBNs and TANs, what they are, and whether or not you may be interested in one. Well, on today's show, we discuss the follow-up to that newsletter, where Suzi not only defines the tests and explains whether or not they're useful, but explores what factors can impact a TBN or TAN. We break down the experiments, the variables she took into account, things like heat, whether or not excess heat will cause a TBN or TAN to fluctuate significantly. And I think this is an interesting departure from what you might normally hear on this show, where we're conducting our own experiments, doing a bit of research to learn more, and give you some insight into what can impact the results you have. Well, this episode certainly has something for you. Here's Suzi and I in studio. When we last had you on, you had written your first newsletter about TBNs and TANs, and I was wondering if you could do a brief recap, kind of like what was your reason for choosing that particular data point, and then what you learned in that first go round.
What was my inspiration for that? I feel like it just seemed like something studyable. It's pretty simple. It's sort of analogous to like pH, which is something you learn as a kid. Mm-hmm. And then it also, because it's kind of a simple concept, it made me wonder why we do that instead of just pH, which it turned out that oil doesn't really conduct electricity in the same way that water does, which is what pH is for. So I kind of just was curious about that, and then it went from there. Customers are also very interested in their TBN.
Yes, very.
And, I would say like a majority of samples have an okay TBN. So, I was curious about what type of things affected it and all that.
Did you have any interesting feedback to the first one as far as people that, were surprised or had more questions after reading?
Gosh, I can't really remember any specific questions, but there were quite a few people that emailed that were just glad to see us address it and go into more detail about it, because it's kind of an interesting thing. It doesn't really have a unit of measure. It's just a number.
Yeah.
And there was a particular type of oil that we had some requests for us to look into it more, because it had... Gosh, I can't remember what the additive package was, but it's weird.
Is it one of the Chevron Delos?
Yeah.
Yeah, is it?
It's like something ADF.
Yep, Chevron Delo ADF.
It's weird in multiple ways. One is that it has a bunch of potassium in it.
Yep.
And so it looks like you have a massive coolant leak, but it's just the oil. And the TBN is also really low. And it has to do with how they formulated the oil for, like, I think some specific, like, emissions reasons.
Yeah, low ash. I think they're trying to meet that specification.
Yeah. So yeah, that was the main enthusiasm that I got. It's just that I finally, we delved into that and kind of concluded, just based on the fact that the samples mostly looked fine, even though the TBN was low. A lot of them were wearing samples.
Yeah.
But that it was probably still a good oil.
So that's my question right off the bat. If someone sends you that ADF oil, they want a TBN, and they want to run longer, how do you approach suggesting an interval when you have this oil that, part of the design means that the TBN is going to be low? So do you rely on the rest of the report when you're making that call like we normally would?
Yeah, I would think if the oil is like way too acidic, that it would start to cause some other issues, like the viscosity would be too thick, or insolubles would be really high, or wear would be high. So if none of those other things are wrong, it's not to say that we would like totally discount the low TBN, but it's a special case. And with everything else looking excellent, it's not anything probably to dwell on.
One thing I've wondered about too is if someone's sampling an oil like ADF in the sense that some of them have a lower TBN than most, but it's directly related to like how much calcium is in there to start. If people want a stronger TBN, sometimes I've thought about suggesting, well, you might just want to get an oil that has a more stout additive package.
Totally.
And, if that, especially if that's like for their peace of mind, right?
Yeah. And there's so many different oils on the market, and they all pretty much work well. So if the TBN is a concern for you, you can definitely choose one at the higher end of the scale, which we've got a list in that of different oil types there that you can look at to see what those are.
When you're looking at the starting TBN, which, for those who aren't initiated, the measure that's showing the active additive ready to use, have you seen any interestingly high or low numbers? We talked about ADF starting out with a low number just due to its additive package, but did you come across any that might have been surprisingly high? Because typically we talk about one around 9 or 10 when it's starting off. Is that what you saw for the most part?
I can't remember in that part 1 what the very top of the scale was.
But the list is in there for people to reference, though.
Yep, and I would definitely say that diesel engine oils seem to start with higher TBNs, which is interesting.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there's like reasons for that. Maybe it's just the diesel engine's harder on the oil.
Well, switching gears to part 2, you had a few conclusions here that were surprising. Even for me, and in the sense that obviously, I'm not doing the same research you're able to conduct here. So this was really good stuff to learn on my end as well. So the first conclusion I want to touch on, you mentioned that, high temperatures can be related to a TBN dropping. So what led you to that conclusion?
I wanted to isolate one factor that can affect the TBN, and temperature was the obvious choice because something that you can replicate in the lab. And so I heated samples of oil to various temperatures. There was 212 degrees Fahrenheit, which is normal operating
Standard,
temperature. 302 degrees Fahrenheit, which is sort of the upper limit of a lot of temperature gauges on vehicles. And then a crazy temperature, which was 392 degrees Fahrenheit, which, fun fact, that will melt the sample bottles. But hopefully no one's oil is actually getting that.
Yeah.
That crazy hot.
Yeah, they might be beyond the point of oil analysis at that juncture.
Something has gone wrong.
Yeah.
I heated up the oil to those temperatures and then removed a little bit of oil to test at 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, and 8 hours. And then tested the TBN and TAN and the viscosity of each of those samples. The high temperatures definitely did cause the oil to drop, and it was the most dramatic at that really crazy high temperature.
Interesting.
So that's kind of what I would expect. Other things are also contributing to the the TBN going down over time, but temperature does seem to be one of the things that can do that. So that was a good thing to confirm in the lab.
And it was equally surprising, I think, if not more so, that you were seeing that high temperatures didn't necessarily have an effect on viscosity. Because, I've definitely been guilty of thinking that, heat would thicken the oil as well as cause high insolubles. And so you were able to see kind of the opposite there. So what were you looking at sample-wise? Were these gasoline engine oils, diesel engine oils, transmission fluid? What exactly were we testing and seeing?
So we were exclusively testing Rotella 15W40.
Okay.
I think that was a gasoline engine oil. And every single sample from 212 to 392 degrees from 2 hours to 8 hours was technically within specifications for that type of oil. At the hottest one at 8 hours was maybe one full Cinestoke thicker than most of the other ones, but it was still the upper limit for that grade is 15.3 Cinestokes, and that's what it was. So I guess we could technically say that it was very barely out of spec, and it didn't look great. It had turned black, but it didn't really affect the viscosity. So I guess we can these are short periods of time, really.
True.
So, we can only take that conclusion so far, but
still sort of a ringing endorsement for Rotella.
yeah.
Because I think so many people, and it's not a bad thing at all, this interest, but some people will just send in a sample because they're convinced that even a brief period of heat exposure related to racing or, some temporary short-lived situation, they'll, have some real concern there about how the oil held up. So it's kind of interesting that it performed like it did.
Yeah, it's too bad I wasn't able to test other parameters too. Obviously, it wasn't really used in an engine, so we can't do wear metals. Insolubles would have maybe been nice to test too, because it's possible that insolubles were high. I would not be surprised if insolubles were pretty high in those samples that totally turned black. But yeah, it's also possible that when there's an overheat, there's like other situations going on simultaneously, like it's like part of the same thing that's going wrong. Like maybe like a lot of blow by or something like that, that could be also contributing to the thick viscosity that we sometimes find.
One additional data point I was wondering about, did you consider purposefully adding contamination to the oil and measuring the effect?
That's something
from
for
that
the future.
standpoint? Because, think about, if you were to just add coolant to it, then run that heat and then see how that might behave. But of course, I think it would be fun to know. It would be interesting. But I think people can sometimes get past the main idea, which is that you need to address the problem, allowing contamination instead of worrying about the tan.
Yeah. And that's part of it, is that the TBN is only a small part of understanding how your engine is doing. So one of the things that I think I was familiar with this already, but in doing the research, it came up again and again, which is that when there's coolant contamination, it shoots the TBN really high. And it must just be like very basic or something. Like it's making, like whatever is in the coolant is skewing the TBN really high. And so, if you have a severe coolant leak and horrible wear and high insolubles and a really great TBN, that doesn't mean that you're okay.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's a good data point for people listening, that the TBN is, I think it can be a great selling point for an oil. But it's never the be-all, end-all. Just like there's not a single test we do that's the be-all, end-all. It's one pie, So,
totally.
So another bullet point I wanted to get into, because this really relates directly to an assumption I had in the past, which is that if the oil is becoming more acidic, if the TBN's dropping, the tan would be sharply going up. But is that actually what you were able to find during your experiments?
Very surprisingly, no. It went in the complete opposite direction, which also led me to retest quite a few of these to make sure that it was correct. Because the TBN is the measure of the oil's ability to neutralize acids, and the tan is the acidity of the oil. And so, you would think that those would correlate. And they seem to in used oil samples that were actually in an engine, with like all of the factors that go into that. But when we were just measuring heat, as the TBN increased, so did the tan, which implies that as active additives are depleted, the oil is becoming less acidic, which didn't make any sense to me. So we can't say for sure why that happened. It's possible that some like TBN boosting additives were damaged or fell out of suspension. And in the real world, as those additives weren't there to like neutralize acids that are constantly building up would build up. But when whatever forces are causing those acids are not present, maybe it just behaves a different way. It's all pretty interesting when you start to isolate things. Like I imagine blow-by or friction or whatever else would be adding to acidity. So I guess those are other things to isolate in the future. You can really just break it down as much as you want to.
You really can. I think another aspect of your testing that's interesting is you talked about some color changes. And I think even earlier, going back to when you talked about heating the samples up and seeing that they would become very dark, but not necessarily have issues with the physical properties. So that's interesting to me, because I think a lot of people see a color change on their end and draw a lot of conclusions from it. but that doesn't necessarily speak to a problem.
Yeah, completely.
So here you talked about testing Aeroshell W100 mineral oil. And can you talk a little bit about the changes visually that you saw when you were testing it?
So when you normally run the TBN and TAN test, it's a titration. So you're mixing together a small amount of your sample with a solvent that allows you to measure the pH, which you couldn't do for the normal sample without the solvent. And then you add... For the TAN test, you add small amounts. Well, the machine adds it. I'm not adding it. The computer is crunching these numbers. But it's adding measured amounts of a basic solution until it reaches a certain pH, and that's where we get the TAN reading from. And normally, nothing happens color-wise. It starts out like a neutral kind of yellowish color and stays that way the entire time. But going through a bunch of samples, and then suddenly I'm like, whoa, they're turning purple. And it was like a bright purple, like a magenta. And, you know, there were a few other people in the lab, and I was like, look at this. And nobody that was there at the time could understand why that was happening. I think someone that had maybe been there longer later mentioned that they've seen it a few times before, but it's not common. And, you know, we're probably also not running TAN tests on that type of oil that often to notice it. But it was like pretty exciting to see because it was pretty mysterious. And I still don't really know exactly why that happened. If it is like a happy accident or if like Aeroshell is like doing something. Like there's, I wrote down how to pronounce this compound.
Yes.
It's called phenolphthalein.
Yes.
It's a pH indicator that we don't use it. I don't think so, but it's used in different like scientific pursuits. And it'll turn purple or kind of a pink color in a basic solution. So I don't know if that is present. I looked up the compounds that are in it, and I don't think we could detect them. But something that behaves the same way seems to be in there. And definitely reacted to the sample becoming like quickly more basic. So I'm curious if any of our listeners know if that's intentional. It seems maybe useful to be able to look at your oil and see it change color. Although I suppose it doesn't mean that the oil would change color. This is a slurry of chemicals that are what changed color. But
which is all to say, it's important to actually go to your results than just based on color changes. You know?
Yeah, completely. They're not always meaningful.
So I think aircraft owners can sometimes feel left out when it comes to these special tests because of things that are inherent to the design of aircraft engine oil. So can you talk about why a TBN won't necessarily lend insight, but also whether or not a TAN would make sense for an aircraft owner?
Well, the TBN is measuring primarily calcium and magnesium, and it can measure maybe a few other things in weird types of oil, but those are not really present in aircraft oils. There could be a little bit of calcium, I guess, in CamGuard, but really tiny amount compared to what you find in an engine oil sample. So the TBN is basically always going to be pretty low. And that's not anything deficient with the oil. A TAN could possibly be useful if you're interested in knowing that data point. I'd say generally speaking, we can tell most of what you'd want to from just the standard tests. So it'd be more like if you're curious or would like to track it, how it changes over time, that could be interesting. But I can't think of too many situations where I've been like, man, I wish I knew what the TAN of this sample was.
Which, if anything, I think it simplifies things for aircraft owners. You know, you don't need to wonder. The standard analysis is generally going to cover your bases. Which is nice. But so you've done quite a bit of experimentation already with TBNs and TANs. Are there any other like variables you want to isolate? Any other tests you might want to do? Or would that just be based on how people respond to this? Either if they have things they're interested in knowing, or is this kind of it for what you want to look at with these two tests?
It's all I have planned at the moment, but if there is a uprising of support for some other pursuit, I would definitely run with it. In the background, not really towards a newsletter, but for personal interest in our field of knowledge here, I have been testing different samples in different situations of engine oil. I've been testing the TANs more often, just because it's not that common that a person will test the TBN and the TAN, because usually one suffices and the TBN is maybe better for engine oil. But I'm trying to look at real world samples to see if things go the way that they did in my newsletter. So far, they don't. It does seem to be an opposite correlation in the real world between the TBN and the TAN. But that's all I have planned for that. I do have other newsletters planned, though, on different topics.
Nice. Okay. So we don't have a release date quite in hand yet for this newsletter, but where can people find it when it will be made available?
Blackstone-labs.com.
And we will be sure to give that a shout out on this show as well, reminding you guys to check it out if you're interested in TBNs and TANs. Again, TBN shows you active additive remaining. A TAN shows you the total acid number. So if those tests interest you, just make sure you note it on your oil slip and we'll get back to you with the results. So I think that brings us to a close.
Awesome.
Thanks for hanging out.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, I hope you enjoyed listening to Suzi and I discuss her work on the follow-up newsletter regarding TBNs and TANs. These are additional tests that go beyond the standard analysis, but I think that after checking out her newsletter that's already available online on blackstone-labs.com, after listening to this show, checking out that newsletter, I think you'll be armed with plenty of knowledge as to whether or not these tests are applicable to you. And if you're interested in adding any of these on, don't hesitate to mention it on your oil information slip. Just mark yes for TBN or TAN. We'll ask for a TBN or TAN depending on whether or not you're filling out a gas diesel slip or if it's a transmission slip. Just let us know if you have any questions and we'll be happy to answer those. You can either give us a call at 260-744-2380 and ask to speak to an analyst if you'd like, or you can send us an email at bstone@blackstone-labs.com. Thanks for hanging with us. Hope you learned something new today. I certainly did after talking with Suzi and breaking down some of these experiments she was able to conduct when not in the business of writing reports, which we are working on very hard every day, getting that data to you as quickly as we can. But as always, thank you so much for stopping by. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.